Skid Row, hi, it's me. Skid Row was one of those oddities of late '80s metal. And so they didn't wear makeup and they didn't have big poofy hairsprayed hair. Um, they still sang songs about girls and partying and stuff, but they also were a lot heavier than a lot of their contemporaries. So it's kind of odd that they became as successful as they did in a top 40 climate where, Whitesnake and Warrant and other bands like that, Poison were very much the flavor of the day. I mean, the late '80s were awesome for hard rock and heavy metal bands. Bon Jovi, Motley Crue, like the aforementioned Warrant and we're doing incredibly well. We're selling a ton of records, and anybody who had any proficiency at guitar and had spandex and poofy hair could get a record contract back in the late '80s. And Skid Row kind of, as much as they drew from a lot of the same influences as their contemporaries, also, again, played a lot heavier and sang about things that a lot of those other bands didn't. Specifically, there was a harder edge to them, musically as well as lyrically, darker, if you will. And on their second record, Slave to the Grind, they went one step darker again. And you can't go so far to say that Skid Row was a political band, but they certainly weren't afraid to throw ideas out there that were more than just thumbing their nose at authority, but actually were giving, in some cases, I mean, a song like "Threat to Society" on their 1990 second album, "Slave to the Grind," a song like "Threat to Society" did more than just go to authority. It actually gave and presented an argument that was worth listening to. So, I mean, of course, being a 15, 16-year-old when albums like this came out, and to have these intelligent, angry lyrics come out, as well as to be presented along with songs that were the heartfelt, obligatory power ballads. But on this record, unlike their first, I mean, the song that catapulted Skid Row into popularity was the song "I Remember You" off of their 1988, 89 debut album, self-titled debut album, and it made them huge. And when this record came out, "Slave to the Grind," it was the #1 album for that week, and it was the biggest debut sales of any album to date. Now, bearing in mind, at that time, SoundScan had actually only started being able to tally numbers instantaneously, like within a 72-hour window. So, I mean, "Houses of the Holy" by Led Zeppelin was considered to be one of the biggest selling debut releases of all time up to that point. And because SoundScan at that point was only able to tally numbers after weeks of getting in the numbers from individual record stores across the countries, and across the country, I guess you could say, in the States and then in Canada and then overseas, and then tally everything together, it would often take weeks, sometimes even months, to really know how well an album had sold. This album came out and was the biggest selling album to date very shortly after SoundScan was released, very early and prior, very, very recently, this is a terrible sentence, just before this album was released. So, still sold a boatload of copies, and deservedly so. I got into a discussion with my wife the other day, talking about how these guys were much better than a lot of the other heavy metal bands of the era. Sebastian Bach was a better singer. The musicianship was, while not necessarily better than some of the other bands, definitely hit harder and went more for the throat musically and lyrically again than a lot of their contemporaries. So If you are a young heavy metal fanatic and you want to understand where the roots of a lot of the new heavy metal bands come from, may I suggest picking up a copy of Skid Row's Slave to the Grind. It is an excellent record. It still holds up 23 years later. Oh my god. Every time I do a review and I talk about albums from my collection that I love and enjoy and still occasionally go to, I mean, there's so much music that I purchase every year, and there's certain albums I still are touchstones, and I go to every now and again just to listen to remind myself um, about all the music that I loved growing up. But it makes me feel really old. I mean, for me to think, yesterday I was playing this album uh, on the way to some of my grade 10 exams, and now it is 23 years later. So, Slave to the Grind by Skid Row is an excellent, excellent album. If you go out and buy it, you may not get one track. See, when this album was originally released, the CD release got an album called Get the Bleep Out, and it was taken off the cassette release and a different song was put in its place, which the name of which I don't remember. My friend Dan, who was a super hardcore Skid Row fan, bought both the cassette and the CD releases so that he could have, a complete collection of Skid Row music. As much of a fan as I like to think of myself, having been of Skid Row, I haven't followed them since Sebastian Bach, their original singer, as they went into major label releases. They had one or two singers before Sebastian Bach joined, and then they got their record contract. But I haven't followed them since Sebastian left the band. And they actually released an EP last year, which I listened to a couple tracks from it, and it's not great, it's not bad, but when you have written an album as excellent as I keep saying this album was, a lot of the other stuff is going to pale by comparison. So this has been 7.5 minutes of me rambling on about a lot of nothing. Slave to the Grind by Skid Row is certainly an album worth picking up. If you can, try to find one of the original pressings that has the song Get the F Out, because it's fun. And it's juvenile, but it's fun. My name is Daryl. Don't stop looking for new music. Don't stop listening to new music. Don't stop listening to music, and just whatever music. It doesn't matter what it is. Music is good, and don't stop listening to it. I've been your critic. Like, share, subscribe. Tell me, what was a late 80s metal band that is still making music today that really you go back to as a touchstone? For me, it's Skid Row, Slave to the Grind, Dr. Feelgood by Motley Crue, Metallica's And Justice for All. What's the album for you? I'll talk to you later.